Thérèse Wands was much put out when she emerged from the white tent and discovered that Captain Call and Captain McCrae had left Lonesome Dove in the night. She had been up early, gathering eggs in her basket from hens' nests in the crumbling house left by Preacher Windhorst. She liked the two young captains. Having them there was a fine change from the company of her husband, Xavier, a man disposed to look on the dark side of life, a man who had little natural cheer in him or even a satisfactory amount of the natural appetites all men should have. Frequently, due to his gloom, Thérèse had to sit on Xavier in order to secure her conjugal pleasures. Xavier was convinced they would starve to death in the western wilderness they had come to, but Thérèse knew better. In only one day, with the rangers there, they had made more money than they would have made in France in a month, doling out liquor in their village for a few francs a day. All day the rangers had drunk liquor and paid them cash money, a fact not lost on Xavier, who threw off his gloom long enough to accord Thérèse a healthy dose of conjugal pleasure without her having to go to the trouble of sitting on him. She sprang up early, ready to make the rangers a fine omelette and collect a few more of their dollars, only to discover that the two rangers she liked best had ridden off to Mexico. Only the black man had seen them leave. The other rangers were as startled as Thérèse to discover they were gone. "You mean they left us here?" Lee Hitch asked. "Yes, sir," Dietz said. "Gone to get the captain." "Well, that's all right, Lee," Stove Jones said. "I imagine they expect us to wait, and at least we'll be waiting in a place where the saloon don't close." "It'll close if Mr. Buffalo Hump shows up," Lee said, with an apprehensive look around the clearing. Toward the river, the Blue Sow and the Blue Boar were standing head-to-head as if in conversation. Xavier Wands was attempting to fasten a bow tie to his collar, a task that soon reduced him to a state of exasperation. At the mention of Buffalo Hump, Jake Spoon came awake with a start. "Why would he show up, Lee?" Jake asked. "There ain't a town here yet. He wouldn't get much if he shows up here." "My tooth twitched half the night, that's all I know," Lee Hitch said. "When my tooth twitches, it means Indians are in the vicinity." "God damn them, why did they go?" Jake said, annoyed at the two captains for leaving them unprotected. Since the big raid on Austin, his fear of Indians had grown until it threatened to spoil his sleep. P.I. was shocked that Jake would use such language in talking about Captain Call and Captain McCrae. They were the captains. If they left, it was for a good reason. Then, to P.I.'s surprise, the Frenchwoman began to wave at him, beckoning him to come help her prepare the breakfast. She was breaking eggs into a pan and swirling it around. Her husband, meanwhile, took out his tablecloth from a bag where he kept it and spread it on the table, smoothing it carefully. The man had on a bow tie, which struck P.I. as unnecessary, seeing as there was only a rough crew to serve. "Quick, monsieur, the woods," Thérèse said when P.I. bashfully approached. He saw that the cook fire was low and immediately got a few good sticks to build it up. As Thérèse swirled the eggs in the pan, her bosom, under the loose gown, moved with the swirling motion. P.I. found that despite himself, his eyes were drawn to her bosom. Thérèse didn't seem to mind. She smiled at him and with her free hand motioned for him to bring more sticks. "Hurry, I am cooking, but the fire is going low," she said. Though it was so early that there were still wisps of ground fog in the thickets, Lee Hitch and Stove Jones presented themselves at the bar, expecting liquor. To P.I.'s amazement, Jake Spoon stepped right up beside them. Only the night before, Jake had confided in him that he didn't have a cent on him. He had lost all his money in a card game with Lee, a man who rarely lost at cards. Xavier Wands put 3 glasses on the bar and filled them with whiskey. Jake drank his down as neatly as the 2 grown men. Both Lee and Stove put money on the bar, but Jake had none to put, a fact he revealed with a smile. "You'll stand me a swallow, won't you, boys?" he asked. "I'm a little thin this morning when it comes to cash." Neither Lee nor Stove responded happily to the request. "No," Lee said bluntly. "No one invited you to be a drunkard at our expense," Stove added. Jake's face reddened. He did not like being denied what seemed to him a modest request. "You're barely weaned off the teat, Jake," Lee said. "You're too young to be soaking up good liquor anyway." Jake stomped off the floor of the saloon, only to discover another source of annoyance. The Frenchwoman had summoned P.I. rather than himself to help her with the cook fire. The woman, Thérèse, was certainly comely. Jake liked the way she piled her abundant hair high on her head. Jake sauntered over, his hat cocked back jauntily off his forehead. "P, you ought to be helping Dietz with the horses. I imagine they're restless," Jake said. To his shock, the Frenchwoman suddenly turned on him, spitting like a cat. "You go away. Ride the horses yourself, monsieur," she said emphatically. "I am cooking with monsieur," she said emphatically. "I'm cooking with Monsieur Pease. You're in the way. Vite, vite. Young goose," she added, motioning with her free hand as if she were shooing away a gosling that had gotten underfoot. Mortified, Jake turned and walked straight down to the river. He had not expected to be so rudely dismissed so early in the day. It was an insult of the worst kind because everybody heard it. Jake would never suppose such a blow to his pride would occur in such a lowly place. It stung. It burned. The high-handedness of women was intolerable, he decided. Better to do as Woodrow Call had done and form an alliance with a whore. No whore would dare speak so rudely to a man. The worst of it, though, was having P.I. chosen over him to do a simple chore. P.I. was gawky and all thumbs. He was always dropping things, bumping his head, or losing his gun. Yet the Frenchwoman had summoned P and not himself. While Jake was brooding on the insult, he heard a splashing and looked down the river to see a group of riders coming. At the thought that they might be Indians, his heart jumped, but he soon saw that they were white men. The horses were loping through the shallows, throwing up spumes of water. The man in the lead was Captain King, who loped right past Jake as if he wasn't there. The men following him were Mexican. They carried rifles and they looked hard. He turned and followed the riders back toward the saloon. When he arrived, Captain King had already seated himself at the table with the tablecloth, tucked a napkin under his chin, and was heartily eating the Frenchwoman's omelette. One of the vaqueros had killed a javelina. By the time Jake got there, they had the little pig skinned and gutted. One of the men started to throw the pig guts into the bushes, but Therese stopped him. "What do? You would waste the best part," Therese said, scowling at the vaquero. "Xavier, come!" Jake and a number of the other rangers, too, were startled by the avid way Therese and Xavier Wands went after the pig guts. Even the vaquero who had killed the pig was taken aback when Therese plunged her hands to the wrists in the intestines and plumped coil after coil of them on a tray her husband held. Her hands were soon bloody to the elbow, a sight that caused Lee Hitch, not normally a delicate case, to feel as if his stomach might come up. "Oh, Lord, she's got that gut blood on her," he said, losing his taste for the delicious omelette he had just been served. Captain King, eating his omelette with relish, observed this sudden skittishness and chuckled. "You boys must have spent too much time in tea parlors," he said. "I've seen you Karankawa Indians, of which there ain't many anymore, pull the guts out of a dying deer and start eating them before the deer had even stopped kicking." "This is fine luck, Captain," Therese said, bringing the heaping tray of guts over for him to inspect. "Tonight we will have the tripes." "Well, that's fine luck for these men. While they're eating tripe, I'll be tramping through Mexico," he said. "Some thieving caballeros run off 50 of our cow horses, but I expect we'll soon catch up with them." "You could take us with you, Captain," Stove Jones said. "Call 'em McCrae, they left us. We ain't got nothing to do." Captain King wiped his mouth with his napkin and shook his head at Stove. "No thanks. Taking you men would be like dragging several anchors," he said bluntly. "Call 'em McCrae were unwise to bring you. They should have left you to the tea parlors." He spoke with such uncommon force that none of the men knew quite what to say. "It was the governor sent us on this errand," Lee Hitch said finally. "He just wanted to get rid of you so he could claim he'd tried," Captain King said with the same bluntness. "Ed Pease knows that few Texas cattlemen are such rank fools as to deliver free cattle to an old bandit like Ahumado. He takes what livestock he wants anyway." "It was to ransom Captain Skull," Stove Jones reminded him. Captain King stood up, wiped his mouth, scattered some coins on the table, and went to his horse. Only when he was mounted did he bother to reply. "Inish Skull is mainly interested in making mischief," he said. "He got himself into this scrape, and he ought to get himself out. But if he can't, I imagine Colin McCrae will bring him back." "Well, they left us," Lee Hitch said. "Yes, got tired of dragging anchors, I suppose," the captain said. He motioned to his men, who looked dismayed. They had cut up the javelina and prepared it for the fire, but so far the meat was scarcely singed. "You will have to finish cooking that pig in Mexico," he informed them. "I cannot be sitting around here while you cook a damn pig. I need to get those horses back and hang me a few thieves." With that, he turned and headed for the river. The vaqueros hastily pulled the slabs of uncooked javelina off the fire and stuffed them in their saddlebags. A couple of the slabs were so hot that smoke was seeping out of their saddlebags as they rode away. Therese and Xavier Wands began to cut up the pig guts, stripping them of their contents as they worked. Xavier had taken off his black coat, but he still wore his neat bow tie. Lee Hitch and Stove Jones were both annoyed by Captain King. In their view, he had been rude to the point of disrespect. "Why does he think we sit around in tea parlors?" Stove asked. "The fool, I don't know. Why didn't you ask him yourself?" Lee said. "Lord, Mexico's a big country," Augustus said. It was a warm night. They had only a small campfire, just adequate to the cooking they needed to do. Just after crossing the river, Call had shot a small deer, meat for a day or two at least. They were camped on a dry plain and had not seen a human being since coming into Mexico. "The sky's higher in Mexico," Gus observed. He felt generally uneasy. "It ain't higher, Gus," Call said. "We've just traveled 60 miles. Why would the sky be higher just because we're in Mexico?" "Look at it," Gus insisted. He pointed upward. "It's higher." Call declined to look up. Whenever Gus McCrae was bored and restless, he always tried to start some nonsensical argument on topics Call had little patience with. "The sky's the same height no matter what country you're in," Call told him. "We're way out here in the country. You can just see the stars better." "How would you know? You've never been to no country but Texas," Gus commented. "If we was in a country that had high mountains, the sky would have to be higher. Otherwise the mountains would poke into it." Call didn't answer. He wanted, if possible, to let the topic die. "If a mountain was to poke a hole in the sky, I don't know what would happen," Gus said. He felt aggrieved. They had left in such a hurry that he had neglected to procure any whiskey, an oversight he regretted. "Maybe the sky would look lower if I had some whiskey to drink," he said. "But you were in such a hurry to leave that I forgot to pack any." Call was beginning to be exasperated. They were in deserted country and could get some rest, which would be the wise thing. "You should clean your guns and stop worrying about the sky being too high," he said. "I wish you'd talked more, Woodrow," Augustus said. "I get gloomy if I have to sit around with you all night. You don't talk enough to keep my mind off them gloomy topics." "What topics?" Call asked. "We're healthy and we got no reason to be gloomy that I can see." "You can't see much anyway," Gus said. "Your eyesight's so poor you can't even tell that the sky's higher in Mexico." "The fact is I was thinking about Billy," Augustus said. "We've never gone on a rangering trip without Billy before." "No, and it don't feel right, does it?" Call agreed. "Now, if he were here, I'd have someone to help me complain and you'd be a lot more comfortable," Augustus said. They were silent for a while. Both stared into the campfire. "I feel he's around somewhere," Augustus said. "I feel Billy's haunting us. They say people who hang themselves don't ever rest. They don't die with their feet on the ground, so their spirits float forever." "Now that's silly," Call said, although he had heard the same speculation about hanged men. "I can't stop thinking about him, Woodrow," Gus said. "I figure it was just a mistake Billy made, hanging himself. If he'd thought it over a few more minutes, he might have stayed alive and gone on rangering with us." "He's gone, though, Gus. He's gone," Call reminded him without reproach. He realized he had many of the feelings Augustus was trying to express. All through the bush country he had been nagged by a sense that something was missing, the troop incomplete. He knew it was Long Bill Coleman he missed, and Augustus missed him too. It was, in a way, as if Long Bill were following them at an uncomfortable distance, as if he were out somewhere in the thin scrub, hoping to be taken back into life. "I hate a thing like death," Augustus said. "Well, everybody hates it, I expect," Call said. "One reason I hate it is because it don't leave you no time to finish conversations," Gus said. "Oh," Call said. "Was you having a conversation with Billy that night before it happened?" Augustus remembered well what he and Billy Coleman had been talking about the night before the suicide. Bill had heard from somebody that Matilda Jane Roberts, their old traveling companion, had opened a bordello in Denver. Mattie, as they called her, had ever been a generous whore. Once on the Rio Grande, bathing not far from camp, she had plucked a big snapping turtle out of the water and walked into camp carrying it by its tail. He and Long Bill always talked about the snapping turtle when Matilda's name came up. "We was talking about Maddie. I believe she's in Denver now," Gus said. "I guess she never made it to California then," Call said. "She was planning to go to California when we knew her." "People don't always do what they intend, Woodrow," Gus said. "Billy Coleman had it in mind to turn carpenter, only he couldn't drive a nail." "It was only a fair shot," Call remembered. "I guess it's a wonder he survived as a ranger as long as he did." "You survive, and you're just a fair shot yourself," Augustus pointed out. "He married," Call said. He remembered how anguished Long Bill had been after he learned that Pearl had been outraged by the Comanches. That discovery changed him more than all their scrapes and adventures on the prairies. "He's out there now, Woodrow. I feel him," Gus said. "He's wanting to come back in the worst way." "He's in your memory. That's where he is," Call said. "He's in mine, too." He did not believe Long Bill's ghost was out in the sage and the thin chaparral. It was in their memories that Long Bill was a haunt. "Rangers oughtn't to marry," he said. "They have to leave their womenfolk for too long a spell. Things like that raid can happen." Augustus didn't answer for a while. "Things like that happen, married or not," he said finally. "You could be a barber and still get killed." "I just said what I believe," Call said. "Rangering means ranging, like Captain Skull said. It ain't a settled life. I expect Bill would be alive if he hadn't married." "I guess it's bad news for Maggie if you feel that way, Woodrow," Gus said. "She's needing to retire." "She can retire if she wants to," Call said. "Yes, retire and starve," Gus said. "What would a retired whore do in Austin to earn a living? The only thing retired whores can do is what Maddie just did, open a whorehouse, and I doubt Maggie's got the capital. I imagine she could borrow it if you went on her note." Call said nothing. He was being as polite as he could. They would need to be at their best if they were to rescue Captain Skull. They ought not to be quarreling over things they couldn't change. He believed what he had just said. Rangers ought not to marry. The business about going on Maggie's note was frivolous. Maggie Tilton had no desire to open a whorehouse. "I doubt Captain Skull is even alive," Gus said. "That old bandit probably killed him long ago." "Maybe, but we still have to look," Call said. "Yes, but what's our chances?" Gus asked. "We'll be looking for one man's bones. They could be anywhere in Mexico." "We still have to look," Call said, wishing Augustus would just quiet down and go to sleep. On the third day, the Rangers came into terrain that looked familiar. They had crossed the same country before, when Inish Skull had first pursued Ahumado into the Sierra Perdida. "We've got to be alert now," Call said. "We're in his country." In the afternoon, they both had the feeling that they were being watched. And yet, as far as they could see, the country was entirely empty of human beings. The mountains were now a faint line far to the west. Augustus kept looking behind him, and Call did too, but neither of them saw anyone. Once Gus noticed a puff of dust far behind them. They hid and waited, but no one came. Gus saw the puff of dust again. "It's them," he said. "They're laying back." Too nervous to leave the problem uninvestigated, they crept back, only to see that the dust had been kicked up by a big mule deer. Gus wanted to shoot the deer, but Call advised against it. "The sound of a gun would travel too far," he said. "The sound of my belly rumbling will too pretty soon if we don't raise some more grub," Gus said. "Throw your knife at him. I don't object to that," Call said. "I think it's time we started traveling at night." "Oh, Woodrow, I hate traveling at night in a foreign country," Augustus said. "I get to thinking about Billy being a ghost. I'd see a spook behind every rock." "That's better than having Ahumado catch you," Call told him. "We're not as important as Captain Skull. They won't send no expeditions after us." "Woodrow, he ain't important either," Augustus said. "None of these ranchers let us have a single cow. I guess they figure the captain's rich enough to pay his own way out." They rode all night, and the next day hid under some overhanging rocks. Gus thought to amuse himself by playing solitaire, only to discover that his deck of cards was incomplete. "No aces," he informed his companion. "That damn Lee Hitch stole every one of them. What good is a deck of cards that don't have no aces?" "You're just playing against yourself," Call pointed out. "Why do you need aces?" "You ain't a card-playing man, and you wouldn't understand," Gus said. "I always knew Lee Hitch was a card cheat. I mean to give him a good licking once we get back to town." "I'd suggest hitting him with a post if you want to whip him," Call said. "Lee Hitch is stout." As dusk approached, they started to edge into the foothills and immediately began to see tracks. People had been on the move, some on horseback, some on foot, and all the tracks led out of the Sierra. Gus, who considered himself a tracker of high skill, jumped down to study the tracks, but was frustrated by poor light. "I could read these tracks if we'd got here a little earlier," he said. "Let's keep going," Call said. "These tracks are probably just made by some poor people looking for a better place to settle." As they passed from the foothills into the first narrow canyon, the darkness deepened. Above them soon was a trough of stars, but their light didn't do much to illuminate the canyon. The terrain was so rocky that they dismounted and began to lead their horses. They had but one mount apiece and could not risk laming them. They entered an area where there were large boulders, some of them the size of small houses. "There could be several pistoleros behind every one of those big rocks," Augustus pointed out. "We might be surrounded and not know it." "I doubt it," Call said. "I don't think there's anybody here." When they had ridden into the Yellow Canyon before, there had been no army of pistoleros, just 3 or 4 riflemen shooting from caves in the rock. Only their Apache scout had seen Ahumado lean out briefly and shoot Hector and the captain. No one else saw him. Ahumado was not like Buffalo Hump. He didn't prance around in front of his enemies, taunting them. He hid and shot. He was only seen by his enemies once he had made them his prisoner.